is one way of doing it. Number two is what, here are a number of things, and again, taking advantage of communication research. I put 3 pictures here that don't seem to fit at all. Paul Lazarsfeld, sociologist in the 40s at Columbia, Victoria's Secret models, and then the founder of Facebook. Why are they all here together? Because they all kind of share one principle, and that is opinion leadership, which Paul Lazarsfeld originated in certain ways, or at least promoted very heavily. Victoria's Secret has campus ambassadors that they use to get products across. In other words, where they seek out, based on research, who the most influential people are on campus, and they're saying, look, I want to get my message across. How do I do this? Do I do this through interpersonal trust? I mean, speaking about different levels of trust, meaning they go out and they talk to their friends, and their friends trust them much more than they would trust any mediated message. And then number 3, of course, the point of Facebook is to collect quantitative data on exactly that, meaning who are the most central nodes, how well are they connected, and so on and so forth. So the point being, in the national academies is just now starting a project trying to capitalize on exactly that. Who are these opinion leaders for science? Who are the people who are most influential, either in communities or in groups? And how can we utilize some of that in order to get our point across and use information? And I think that's exactly the right approach. But there are decades of research out there. There are tools out there to do this. And AAAS is just beginning to have their first Facebook group, which is great. But obviously there's unlimited potential. Number 3. Really quickly, values matter. I touched on this, and here I'm just repeating a little bit what Dan has already talked about, Kahan has already talked about. And I think this will become, and again, I'm echoing something that Dan said, it'll get worse. Simply because scientific issues are increasingly, and especially as science writers are moving out, politics writers will take over, others will take over, and scientific issues like nano are in most people's minds not science necessarily. They're science and politics, they're science and morals, they're science and medicine. So they're bleeding over into other areas. And if we like it or not, public funding will depend on public support. And if the public is uninformed, we may sit here and we may complain, but they'll still go out and vote, and they'll still support federal funding guidelines for stem cell and others. So these perceptual filters that I talked about, or these values, worldviews that a number of us talked about, I think is critical, and will an understanding of how they work will influence how we deliver information. Here are a few pieces of information that are, again, maybe less thought out than I would want them to be, but I still wanted to put them up here. Just because, and I put those in earlier after one of the first talks. I was initially not planning on talking about them, but simply I want to highlight quickly the moral component that is beginning to emerge to some degree for nano. So what I'm showing here is really a link between the level of religiosity measured at an aggregate level world values survey, and then answers to a question that says, how much do you agree with a whole series of statements, including that nano is morally acceptable? We didn't come up with the wording. We paralleled wording that the Eurobarometer used in our US survey, and then here the other surveys. And what you see is a fairly strong regression between religiosity and these moral views, with Ireland, Austria, Italy, some of the Catholic countries, and then certainly the US being all the way up here, and then some of the more secular European countries being down here. And again, I don't want to get caught up in the correlation, and we've run a whole series of models, including a number of controls. But really the point being, morals matter, regardless if you buy into this particular slide. And let me show you another one that correlates that particular question, meaning people who either strongly or somewhat agree that nano is morally acceptable, or strongly or somewhat disagree that nano is morally acceptable, and then matching that up with levels of support for certain regulations. So here's, I approve of nanotechnology as long as the usual levels of government regulation are in place. I approve of nanotechnology if it's more tightly regulated. I do not approve of nanotechnology except under very special circumstances. I do not approve under nanotechnology under any circumstances. Again, not our wording, Eurobarometer wording. But what you see is very clearly that among those who think that nano is not morally acceptable, who disagree with that statement, that's the only group of people who actually ends up in this end. It's the majority of the people who end up here and the majority of the people who end up here. So the only group where we have a majority of the people who say nano is morally acceptable is the one that says, well, usual government regulations are, as long as usual government regulations are in place. So there's a direct correlation really between these two, and again, very preliminary. I don't mean to draw broad sweeping conclusions here. I just wanted to show you again, I think it highlights the need for research in this particular area. So that's what I wanted to mention. Number 4, and I think this is one of the things that we as academics have a real problem with, good communication is proactive. It's not reactive. It's something that you do before things get out of hand. And I just have a few examples here from Europe. I've shown these before at other instances. Every product release I've seen in Europe on nanotechnology is framed around the nano as nature frame. It's green colors, it's brown colors, it's the lotus effect that is trademarked, parallels to nature. And essentially the argument in most product descriptions is that, look, this has been going on for thousands of years. We're just taking principles of nature and are utilizing it for our own purposes, and nano allows us to do this better than it ever has. They've learned from Frankenfood, they've learned from Magic Nano, and other things. And they also have some of these preemptive campaigns. You saw the Science for a Better Life campaign. Here is a more explicit nano campaign. And these campaigns run in the equivalent of Us Weekly, in the equivalent of People magazine. They don't run in the equivalent of Scientific American or the equivalent of the MIT Technology Review. So these are campaigns that run beforehand, before a potential conflict arises, and they run very much with the idea of promoting science. A few concluding comments. I think what will happen, we'll go through the same stages, and we are right now going through the same stages that we've gone through in the past for other technologies. Initially, science and economic coverage dominates, but then we go very quickly, and we go through a very usually narrow set of frames. Ethical issues, absolutely. Strategy between key policy players, regulatory players battling environmental defense, and so on. And then uncertainty, very often paired with a Pandora's box idea. So if we go ahead with this, what are we getting ourselves into, and what will happen? And that's what the scientific, what the societal debate will really focuses around. Nano absolutely won't be any different. What does that mean? To just one last slide and wrap it up. Communication, in my opinion, is for experts. It's very much like any other scientific disciplines. It's based on research, and it's for people who know what they're doing based on research. Number 2 is the idea that we should use effective communication, and I put the article from The Scientist up here that one of my former students at Cornell, now at American, and I wrote, and the criticism that we got in response to this article was mostly, look, you're promoting spinning science, you're promoting marketing science, as I mentioned earlier, and I think I would turn this argument around, and I would say, look, the reason why this NERD, for instance, and why projects like it are so important is because what we've been doing to some degree has been very unethical, because it has been favoring groups of audiences who are already information rich, and it has neglected other groups who may not turn to the outlets that we chose to be appropriate for our particular work. And so I think the solution to this is, A, segment our audiences carefully, know who they are, how they function, what the barriers are to reaching them. And then go through and say, what are their informational needs? What are their concerns? What are their channel preferences? Where do we reach them, and how do we reach them, and what do we need to address when we do talk to them? And ultimately, I think what it comes down to is narrowing communication gaps. I do think that's one of the most overlooked things in what we've been doing so far. And I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully have provided enough fodder for criticism and so on, and we can get to the next. Thank you.